Good day, everybody. I am Luis Augusto de Castro Neves. I'm president of the Brazil-China Business Council, and I am very honored to be able to introduce a webinar whose title is New Infrastructure Emerging Trends in Chinese Investment in Latin America. It's a very important theme nowadays in which we are seeing very important changes, not only in international relations, but also in international economic relations as well as that. And it is absolutely opportune to study the profile of Chinese investment in Latin America, which is being changed and is characterized by large capital-intensive projects related to commodities and electricity. These investments also started to include smaller and more numerous ventures, particularly in sectors such as telecommunications, information technology, and energy transition. Areas described by Beijing as the new infrastructures. I would mention the growing importance of high-techs, which are aiming at securing reliable supply chains of strategic components, such as the case, for instance, of production of lithium, which is the essential element of producing batteries for a more electrified world. This shift also reflects a transformation in the strategic goals of the Chinese leadership, which seeks a more sustainable engagement in its foreign policy. As we know, Beijing aims to be carbon-free by 2060, a considerable challenge for the bigger polluter in the world, and the nature of Chinese projects abroad has already started to reflect this ambition. At the same time, China has been betting in a quality-oriented economic growth in the last years. The idea is to introduce more value rather than more products, but faces new endeavors, such as the consequences of the industrial overcapacity. The crisis, which was brought about by the pandemic, did create the problem for the Chinese with the overcapacity and the enormous amount of stocks. The idea of switching the Chinese economic growth to internal consumption is a very difficult aim to achieve, because to foster consumption, it does deal with other sectors of the economy, such as healthcare and social security as a whole, which is something China is still lacking. To start the debate, I would now pass the floor to Claudia Trevisan, Executive Director of Brazil-China Business Council and moderator of today's event, so she can present our guests and explain the dynamics of the webinar.
Thank you, Ambassador.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good morning to everybody, and thank you all for being with us today. We have the privilege of having this webinar to long-term observers of Chinese investments in Latin America and in Brazil. Margaret Myers is Director of the Asia and Latin American Program at the Inter-American Dialogue, adjunct researcher with the Núcleo Milenio sobre los impactos de China en América Latina, and a senior advisor to the United States Institute of Peace. She is the co-author of the report, New Infrastructure, Emerging Trends in Chinese Foreign Direct Investments in Latin America and the Caribbean, published by the Inter-American Dialogue early this year. Margaret, welcome. It's great to see you, and thank you so much for the collaboration in this webinar. Tulio Cariello is Director of Content and Research at the Brazil-China Business Council, and since 2012 has been following bilateral relations in the areas of trade, investment, and politics. Tulio is the author of the flagship report about Chinese investments in Brazil that the Brazil-China Business Council publishes every year. The next one will be released in August. Welcome and thank you, Tulio. We will start the event with presentations from Margaret and Tulio. After that, we will open for questions. I have some questions of my own, and I invite you to submit yours using the Zoom Q&A tool that you can find on the bottom of your screen. Let's start. Margaret, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Claudia, for the very warm welcome. It's a tremendous honor to partner with the Brazil-China Business Council on this event and to join you, Claudia, and Tulio, and the ambassador for this discussion. I've learned so much from all of you over the years, so thank you for the opportunity. I'm also thrilled to have the opportunity to share some findings from the study that Claudia mentioned about China's so-called new infrastructure in Latin America and the Caribbean, which, as was mentioned, is co-authored, in this case with Angel Melguizo and Yifang Wang. So if we could pull up the presentation, I'll share some of the findings. Thank you. And we'll go to the second slide. Thanks. So in the paper, we suggest that China is increasingly focusing on what we call new infrastructure, right, in Latin America and the Caribbean and also elsewhere. This is a term that China has used to describe priority industries of focus at home, certainly, but then also increasingly abroad. The term new infrastructure emerged in China around 2018 and was also featured in China's 14th five-year plan. It's since been, apparent in various different places, woven throughout Chinese policy documents, and in general is meant to encompass those industries, telecommunications, fintech, renewable energy, for instance, that are broadly innovation related, but are also key components of China's economic growth strategy. China has promoted these sectors quite extensively at home in recent years, but is also shifting its technological frontier outward at the moment, and especially in parts of the developing world, which have been comparatively open to China's technologies. There is no one definition of what new infrastructure encompasses, but a prominent news outlet in Shanghai called the paper.cn has suggested that we try to remember the new infrastructure priority industries by using our ABCs. And so you can see here, A is artificial intelligence, B is blockchain, and the remainder are all cutting edge innovation intensive industries. So this gives us a sense of what this term broadly encompasses. Let's go to the next slide. Before I move on to our findings from the report about how all of this applies in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, I'd like to quickly note that new infrastructure, this term, is closely related to and is even something of a stepping stone toward a more recent term and more recent conceptualization, which is new quality productive forces. This is sort of the newest iteration in China's evolving industrial policy thinking and was first mentioned by Xi Jinping in 2023. But by 2024, by this year, it had already been transformed into a national economic development strategy. Like new infrastructure, the term new quality productive forces or new quality production, right, focuses on upgrading China's high-tech industrial capacity. But it also importantly appears to support some degree of overcapacity or overproduction, especially in EVs, for instance, or renewable energy equipment, with the expectation that this will promote entry into strategic markets. And this overcapacity is justified on the basis of potentially contributing to solutions for the climate crisis. All of this, of course, new infrastructure, new quality productive forces has numerous implications for China's engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean. It can mean Latin American access to low-cost technologies and equipment and services in frontier industries, but it can also raise, or in some cases worsen, concerns about dumping as low-cost goods flood certain markets. Let's move to the next slide. So a few years ago, as my co-authors and I were following industrial policy debates in China, we were also witnessing what appeared to be a focusing of Chinese companies on increasingly tech-heavy and/or innovation-related sectors in Latin America and parts of the Caribbean. And so we set out last year to work with FDI data, foreign direct investment data, to determine whether China's policy efforts at home were affecting its investments abroad, and specifically in Latin America and the Caribbean, or in other words, whether we were seeing evidence of a BRI 2.0, as it's been called. And what we found was, in fact, an increasingly pronounced focus over time on those very sectors that China has called new infrastructure. In Latin America, this has mostly translated as a focus on electric vehicles manufacturing, so that includes battery, car, and bus manufacturing. Other high-end manufacturing, so medical and machinery making, for instance, information and communications technologies of all sorts, renewable energy, that includes hydroelectricity, and urban infrastructure, so rail and other urban transport, and ultra-high voltage transmission lines, which are important in the context of Brazil in particular. As you can see in this graph, there is considerable growth over time in the percentage of projects that are new infrastructure projects. And in 2022, the final year, right, Chinese FDI in these new infrastructure industries accounted for 58%, or around 3.7 billion of total annual Chinese FDI in the region, and over 60% of the total number of FDI deals announced by Chinese companies that year. So we see this happening both in terms of the overall value of the projects and the number of projects per year as a percentage of overall FDI. Let's go to the next slide. We also looked specifically at what was happening in some of these industries, these new infrastructure industries. In the ICT sector, the information and communications technology sector, we saw not only considerable growth and investment over time, but also a rapid expansion into new areas of ICT business. So efforts, for example, to integrate IoT technologies, cloud services, and cybersecurity solutions. And other combinations of all of these things, right? And these examples were especially evident in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. Interestingly, computing accounted for a sizable 41% of total ICT investment in the region between 2018 and the first half of 2023. So has become a very prominent part of this overall ICT landscape. We think a lot about 5G. It goes way beyond that. And interestingly, Huawei is even at this juncture entering the renewable energy market in an effort to build solar facilities that will power data centers, for example, in parts of the country, parts of the region, that is. Let's move to the next slide. Looking at China's ICT investment across the region, sort of geographically, right, we see a real diversification into both equipment and various services in much of South America, and then a continued focus on the provision of mainly low-cost equipment, so handsets, for example, very low cost, $20 in some instances, smartphones, and Chinese companies are among the few that can produce at a price point that is reasonable for consumers in those markets, in Central America in particular. Nicaragua, as you can see here, is a different color, has a different color circle. It's the main exception to the sort of focus on equipment and low-cost equipment in Central America because of a satellite deal struck by Wang Jing, who was the individual who owned the company that was supposed to build the Nicaragua Canal. Let's move to the next slide. The shift in the energy sector is also quite striking, especially if we look at it as a share of total annual FDI in the region. Here you see a dramatic shift from investment in traditional energy sources, so hydrocarbons primarily, to renewables, including hydropower, starting around 2017. And indeed, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, we saw major acquisitions of dams across the region starting right around then, including the acquisition of Duke Energy's assets in Brazil, but in many other countries as well. We saw this happen. but then also wide-ranging other renewable energy investments, solar in particular, but also some examples of wind and other investment of this sort. It's important to note here that this shift isn't evident across the entirety of China's economic activity in the region, right? China is still importing significant quantities of lac crude and coal, and China's oil-backed loans, though issued many years ago in certain cases, right, continue to drive some of the region's extractive activity. Ecuador is a prominent example of this. We'll go to the next slide. Even though I think it's important to point out that even though new infrastructure is a major focus of late, and we are hearing far less about the sort of large-scale, sometimes cross-regional connectivity enhancing, infrastructure projects that were emblematic of the BRI around 2015, we are still very much seeing interest in some of China's traditional sectors of focus. So, new infrastructure is growing, but those traditional areas remain. And by that, I mean agriculture, for example, which has been of interest for a couple of decades now, even more in certain cases, right? Mining, and also some degree of transport infrastructure. Infrastructure has not disappeared, right? Transport infrastructure, other basic infrastructure is not something that China is no longer doing necessarily. It's just not at the scale necessarily that we've seen before. One major exception to this is the Shanghai port, right? But as we know, that was negotiated many years ago, really at the height of BRI promotion of these sorts of large-scale projects. And interestingly, I mean, the value of Chinese investment in Latin American and Caribbean extractives has grown over time as a share of total Chinese deals, especially over the past 5 years. But this is mostly explained by a rise in Chinese critical metals and minerals investment in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we've seen an absolute surge in Chinese lithium in just the past few years, really just 5 years, given that critical metal relation to China's priority industries as a critical part of the supply chain, but also in gold and other metals with tech-related applications. And you can see here, that lithium investment, obviously China's lithium investment is focused primarily in the lithium triangle. There is some small investment in Mexico too. But gold and other metals have also factored quite considerably given their tech-related applications. And you can see some focus on investment, foreign direct investment in its various forms, right, in those projects as well. Let's move on. In the study, we also sought to determine top country recipients of Chinese investment over time. And Brazil, as we know, has accounted for the vast majority of Chinese FDI in the region from 2003 to 2022, or about 42% of the region's total during that time frame. Chinese FDI to Brazil was more than double, as you can see, right, investment in Peru, which was the second largest recipient of Chinese FDI during that period. China's FDI in Brazil is also relatively diversified at this point. You can see the breakdown by sector, though with a notable historical, at least, focus on the country's extractive sectors and utilities. Let's move on. That said, and I'm sure Tulio will make this case too and has done so beautifully in the Brazil-China Business Council report, Brazil's relative importance as a destination for Chinese investment has declined somewhat over the past 5 years, right, in favor, in this case, of Chile, Peru, and Mexico. The total boost in Peru's overall standing was mostly attributable to continued Chinese investment in the country's mining sector, and also the 2019 $3 billion Shanghai port project. Ecuador dropped off the map, so to speak, during the Rafael Correa administration, right? So 2007 to 2017, when the country was mostly receiving sovereign loans from China's policy banks, and then only recently climbed back onto the list of top 10 LAC recipients of Chinese FDI. Chile, interestingly, has really transformed over the past few years into a major destination for Chinese investors, even though it barely factored as an investment destination from 2003 to around 2016. Chile's lithium is of interest to wide-ranging investors, but Chinese investors have also focused on electricity generation and transmission projects there, in addition to a handful of agricultural deals and some ill-fated, as it turns out, data projects. Investment in mining and power accounts for about 90% of China's total FDI stock in Chile. And then in Mexico, you know, I should have put a graph for Mexico, but you know, it's a really interesting story in itself in that, you know, we've seen a surge in high-end manufacturing investment, which really corresponds in many ways with the nearshoring phenomenon that we've seen of late. So, you know, there's more to share, and I can talk more about these findings if of interest, but in the interest of time, let me just note that, you know, these trends are likely to continue as China continues to focus on the sectors that it has prioritized very extensively at home, according to what is really an evolving industrial calculus. Xi Jinping has essentially doubled down on these priority industries, especially the so-called new three, right, which refers to EV, solar panels, and lithium batteries. And with this new quality productive forces concept that I mentioned earlier on. All of this will have implications not just for Latin American and Caribbean actors, but also for the many other partners hoping to operate and compete in these spaces, right? It has raised some alarm in the US and elsewhere about, you know, the prospects for competition or for survival in some of these industries. Many, you know, of these companies suggest they're being outbid by Chinese investors, some of which come to the table with substantial support from their government and from state banks. For Latin American nations, right, the challenge will be to maximize the benefit of Chinese and other engagement in new infrastructure industries, whether through, you know, policies that are promoting of tech transfer in whatever form of local content, substantial use of local content, right? And in general, you know, just foundational legal and regulatory frameworks and mechanisms. And if we're talking ICT, right, consumer protection and privacy mechanisms that are fit for purpose. So it's a transforming landscape. We're in a new phase of Chinese overseas engagement, whether it's BRI 2.0 or not. And this indeed will have a lot of implications for policymaking in the future. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Margaret, so much. Great presentation. And yeah, I think Latin America, every country in Latin America needs to have a strategy, you know, of how to benefit most by these Chinese investments. And it's a challenge, you know, to have it. Well, Tulio, the floor is yours. And Tulio will focus more on Brazil.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, Margaret, for this awesome presentation. It's a pleasure to debate this topic with both of you. As Claudia just said, I believe my role here is to comment on Margaret's presentation from a Brazilian perspective, and also to elaborate on some aspects of the Chinese investments in Brazil in the context of the Chinese engagements in Latin America. Camila, could you pop up the presentation, please? Thank you. It's very interesting to notice that even though we use different sources of information concerning the Chinese investments in the region, in the end of the day, we have almost the same results as we were commenting earlier this morning. Next slide, please. For instance, the value in US dollars of the Chinese investments in Brazil has plummeted in the last years, as we can see here in this graph, especially in 2022, since it reached one of the lowest results in history, dropping almost 80% in comparison to the previous year. Next slide, please. On the other hand, as we can see here, also in 2022, we saw a surge in the number of Chinese deals in Brazil, including greenfield projects and mergers and acquisitions that reached 32 confirmed projects, which is the highest number registered so far. So again, we see a clear similarity in our analysis in Margaret's because we confirm this trend of fewer capital-intensive projects in contrast with more diversified projects in key areas for the Chinese foreign policy strategy. But it's also worth noticing that it doesn't mean that the Chinese stopped investing in big capital-intensive projects in Brazil. Margaret just said that also, and also in South America. So we still have considerable investments, for example, in the agribusiness sector, as well as in the mining sector in all the region. Next, please. And now we see here that in terms of stock, the Chinese have invested heavily in the energy sector in Brazil since 2007. If we consider the electricity sector and the oil extraction sector, we see that both account for about 70% of all the value invested by China in Brazil. The electricity sector alone accounts for 45% of all the productive capital poured by Chinese companies in the country so far. Next, please. Next slide, please. But if we consider the number of projects, could you just go back, please, Camila? I'm sorry. Yes. If we consider the number of projects, as we can see here, we see that, again, the electricity sector leads the attraction of Chinese investment, but right after it comes the manufacturing industry and the information and technology sector. And here I'd like to highlight the manufacturing industry because we have many subsectors in it, such as electric appliances, heavy machinery, automobile, and even textile more recently. And that's something we wouldn't imagine a few years ago, since historically Brazilian companies frequently go to China looking for this kind of product and not the other way around. And also considering that Brazil is by far the largest country in Latin America. For comparison, it's 3 times the size of Argentina, which is the second biggest country in the region, and we also have the largest population. It's also interesting to analyze the Chinese investments in each Brazilian state. Next slide, please. And here I'd like to highlight that as far as we know, the Chinese have invested in 23 of the 27 federative units of Brazil. Maybe we have also investments from China in those other states, but we don't have this data so far. But it's interesting to notice that the investments are concentrated in the Southeast region, especially in São Paulo, which is the richest state of Brazil. We see here that São Paulo attracted 36% of all projects in the country. Next, please. So in this context, I believe it's a good idea to use the state of São Paulo as a general sample of the Chinese investments in new infrastructure, as Margaret said, such as fintechs and energy transition. We see that the state attracted almost all the investments in information technology sector, with deals made by well-known large Chinese companies like Tencent and Financial Didi, but also by other smaller Chinese companies. And it's also worth noticing that some of those companies invest not only in big Brazilian tech companies, but also in Brazilian startups, including in Series Z funding, which means those Chinese companies are actually pushing forward those Brazilian startups. But it's also important to say that they generally invest alongside other companies from various countries, including the US. And next, please. And this trend of investments in the IT sector is actually quite new. If we take all the investments in this sector year by year since 2014, as we can see here in this graph, when we first recorded the Chinese projects in the IT sector in 2014, we see that the highest amount of investments was in 2021 and 2022. So both years together have more projects than all the previous years combined. So it's clearly a new trend here in Brazil. We can stop the presentation now, Camila, thank you. And concerning the investments in energy sector, in energy transition more specifically, we have many interesting examples. In fact, the projects in this area are not new. Firstly, because all investments in the electricity sector in Brazil are in green energy, especially in hydropower. And those companies are not only important to Brazil, but also to the Chinese companies, right? For example, State Grid has about half of all its investments abroad in Brazil, while China Three Gorges has 60% of all its investments abroad in the country. And we also have some projects in solar and wind power conducted by companies like BYD, China General Nuclear, and State Power Investment Corporation. But there is something new in the investments in energy transition here, when we see substantial projects in the automobile industry. Some years ago, the Chinese automaker Great Wall Motors bought a car factory from Mercedes in the state of São Paulo. And all the Brazilian media was talking about this new project because they not only kind of saved an important source of jobs for the local population, but they also started to invest in electric vehicles, EVs, right? And it's a considerable investment in the long term because they intend to invest about $2 billion in the next 10 years or so. Another good example of investment in energy transition in the automobile sector is the recently confirmed project of BYD in Bahia, in the northeast part of Brazil. They bought a car factory from Ford, who kind of abandoned its investments in the region and announced that they would change their business model in Brazil. And it was announced that BYD will invest about $1 billion in the former Ford factory to produce electric and hybrid vehicles locally. So I believe these are two compelling examples of this new trend in the Chinese investments in Brazil. Firstly, because these are two Chinese private companies taking place of two very traditional Western automakers in Brazilian market. Second, because BYD and GWM, which is the acronym for Great Wall Motors, are in some aspects contributing to a transformation in the Brazilian auto industry with new technology and even with relatively accessible electric vehicles. And finally, because I see that these Chinese automakers are actually trying to create a new image about Chinese products in Brazil. I mean, for a long time, Chinese products were considered cheap and of bad quality, but nowadays some segments of the market recognize some Chinese products are among the best in the market, and the electric vehicle is a good example of this scenario. And by the way, I'd like to share a quick story with you guys. That the other day I saw an ad from BYD in a Brazilian podcast I was listening to about this new EV that costs 100,000 reais, which is of course an expensive car, but not that expensive if we consider one of the cheapest combustion cars in the Brazilian markets costs around 70,000 reais. I mean, they are trying hard to be a reference in the national market. If you ask any EV aficionado in Brazil, he or she will obviously have BYD as a reference. So summing up in general, I think the fact that Chinese investments in Brazil hit a historic low in terms of value is not a lack of interest of the Chinese companies in investing here. So much so that the number of projects surged recently, as I mentioned. And we are actually witnessing new investments in different sectors, some of them very promising areas. So I believe that's my contribution for now, and I pass the floor back to Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you, Tulio. And I think you highlighted some of the most interesting aspects of the recent investment of Chinese companies in Brazil, especially in this area of electric cars that is really shaking the Brazilian automaker industry. And I will start the questions with a question from the audience, then I go to my questions. There's a question from Renato Baumann, which is from IPEA, the main government research economic institute in Brazil, and also a member of the CEBC Consulting Council. And Renato asks, to what extent do these investments imply technology transfer? It's for Margaret. And if they don't imply, what the countries, this is my question, in the region can do? Is there an opening for this from the Chinese side?
I mean, in all honesty, I think this is something that has not been sufficiently studied, in part because this is all evolving, right? At this moment, we're seeing these intensive focuses in new sectors of interest, or, I mean, in the ICT landscape, it's transforming so rapidly. We're not just talking 5G, we're talking all of these things, right? So it's better studied in Africa, China relations, than it is in Latin America, China relations. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to look in a little bit more depth at how these things are playing out. There are instances where there is a degree of training involved. There is some degree of technology transfer, and there are locals working on relatively high-tech projects, you know. There are others where there's very little evidence to date, or there are promises that things will happen, whether in terms of technology transfer or you know, industrial upgrading capacity, such as in the lithium industry. So you have a lot of promises by Chinese companies to build lithium battery or else lithium processing factories, right, in Argentina, albeit with little, you know, actual progress to date. That doesn't mean it won't happen, but there's not been a lot of evidence of progress since those announcements were initially made. So I think it will be incumbent upon either, and you know, as Tulio pointed out so beautifully with that slide, right? A lot of this is being negotiated at the local level, especially if we're talking about federalized systems. So it's not just incumbent upon, you know, national governments, but also local governments to ensure that in the negotiations themselves, right, and in working with these companies in general, that there is some component of or commitment to technology transfer in whatever form, and that that companies, in addition, are held accountable to that promise, right? So there are various ways to achieve that. I'm by no means an expert on you know, advising on that particular objective, but you know, I would say at this point there are a wide range of things happening. The other thing I would mention are these studies centers, which China sometimes talks about as though they are technology transfer, right? So you have partnerships between universities that do studies, for example, on deep space research, or on you know, on exploration for lithium, or on it tends to be, you know, connected to sectors that are of critical interest to China. But then also you know, trainings that are carried out by Huawei and you know, others across the entirety of the region, more or less, that are intended to update local engineers and others on Chinese technologies and standards, and to ensure that those technologies and standards are well applied in the context of Latin America. So that is in some form a part of that, right? It's a little bit different than the companies themselves transferring this through investments. But it's evolving, and it demands a lot more attention.
Thank you, Margaret. Yes, again, it's a task for the countries also, not only a Chinese task.
Right.
And Tulio, both you and Margaret said that these new emerging trends happen in parallel of the maintenance of also traditional investments. And we saw this in Brazil last year. I think some of the largest investments that were announced in Brazil was by State Grid, the one bid to build a large transmission line in Brazil. and by CNOOC, China National Offshore Oil Corporation, that also won bids to explore oil in Brazil. And what this tells about Chinese investments in Brazil, and there is also a conversation in the chat about why China invests in the electric sector in Brazil and in Latin America. Then Tulio, you can answer, and then if Margaret wants also to comment something about this the reasons for investments in the electric section, you are welcome. Tulio.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We know Beijing has a very ambitious goal of carbon neutrality by 2060, and for that they have been investing heavily in green energy domestically, especially because China is the largest emitter of CO2 with more than 1/4 of global emissions. But besides that, China has also been investing in green energy projects abroad, just like Margaret report shows us. But we also see the same trend in other areas, like Europe, considering the large investments in EV factories in the continent, and also in the BRI. But specifically in Brazil, I believe Chinese investments in green energy actually started, let's say, before it was cool, especially in the hydropower sector. Considering Brazil is probably the only country with perfect conditions to receive investments in this sector. I mean, it's the only place China can export its technology of ultra high voltage transmission lines. In fact, they are responsible for one of the biggest energy transmission lines in Brazil. And I think it happens this way because Brazil, just like China, is a huge country with huge territory. We have a relatively stable regulatory system. We also have very qualified engineers and staff in general, and it's something the Chinese executives usually say about Brazil. I mean, the US is also a very large country with good engineers, but I don't believe it would be possible to see State Grid or China Three Gorges constructing and operating an energy transmission line crossing the entire country like here. And it's the same thing with Canada or Australia, for example. And besides that, Brazil has perfect conditions to receive solar and wind power projects because of our general weather. We are also very interested in projects in the agribusiness sector, such as climate-friendly farms, carbon neutral beef. And this is an area Brazil could also cooperate with China, considering we are home of some of the biggest companies in the world, like JBS and BRF Brazil Foods. And finally, there is this new concept of power shoring, which is something that our friend Jorge Arbachi usually says, meaning that companies from other countries, China included, could invest in Brazil because we have all these favorable conditions to generate green energy that could power up local industries and that could also even be exported to neighbor countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Tulio. Yeah, before I pass to Margaret, related to this question of why China invests in the electric sector, I think this transfer of the export of Chinese technology plays a role. China has a huge capacity for solar panels, to wind farms, and technology that it can export to very few countries, like the technology of the high voltage transmission lines. That is a technology for transmission of electricity in long distance. That's something that Brazil offers this opportunity. And there is also, I don't know if Margaret agrees, the need for the internationalization of these energy companies. There is a strategy also to go abroad and make business abroad and make money. I think in in Brazil, in this electric sector, the companies that are here are making money.
Yeah.
Margaret.
I agree with everything that's been said. I would add only that, there's been a history. I mean, for the past 2 decades, we've seen so much of what China's doing in the region be shaped either by concerns about food or energy security, right? Its own food and energy, or by concerns about supply chain security or the exportation of excess capacity, just as Claudia mentioned, right? So that could be excess capacity in, for example, EV production, which we're now seeing, play out in across the entirety of the globe. But it can also mean excess capacity in labor, in the availability of construction firms or whatever it is, to carry out projects overseas at a moment when they may not have as many opportunities at home. And so I think this is largely a translation of that, of seeking out opportunities, in sectors where China is very well positioned. It has State Grid, obviously. It has China Southern Power. There are others, China Three Gorges that are doing these things, right, all over the region. Another thing I would say is sometimes they're begged to come and do it, right? There are not others after major corruption scandals, for example, or evidence of mismanagement of some of these projects. That are willing to step in and take control of what is, a critical function, right, for cities and others. So there are instances where they have been asked to step into the fold to make this happen. That's especially true in hydroelectricity, less so in transmission, but we do see evidence of that. And then, I think a big part of this also, if we're thinking strategically, right, is China needs power to ensure power is there, both in terms of generation and transmission, right? To feed a lot of the investments that it is currently making in some of these high-tech sectors, right? We all know that these data centers require immense amounts of energy, right? And transmission to them, right? And then so whether that's solar or other forms of energy. So if this is going to work, the need to have a consistent, and reliable transmission network and generation network is absolutely fundamental. And so I do believe this is part of a broader view of how to carry that out. There are views in the U.S. also that this is an interest in, in having a dominant position in a strategic sector, right, and that playing out in some sort of political manner. I don't know that for me, that's not the primary motivation, but certainly that has provoked some major concerns in Peru, mostly about China's, antitrust concerns, right? China selling electricity to itself for transmission, essentially, when you have, Lima essentially 100% run by Chinese companies in terms of generation and transmission. And then also in Chile very recently with some of those acquisitions where there's concern about too much SOE, state-owned enterprise involvement in this sector.
Thank you, Margaret. Very interesting, this point of having supply of energy to support Chinese investments in the region. It's a very, very interesting aspect of it. Margaret, I will continue with you.
Sure.
Given the current global geopolitical climate, how do these Chinese investments in Latin America fit into the larger picture of China's international strategy, especially in relation to the United States and European countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think in all honesty, so much of this is my particular viewpoint. Of course, there are many that would disagree with me, is that so much of this is driven not by it's a little bit of a mix, right? So primarily by an understanding of what China needs to do domestically from an economic security, economic, industrial transformation, industrial policy perspective to ensure even moderate rates of growth in the coming years. And what they have determined is that, the previous model of growth, intensive focus in the real estate sector is not sustainable, right? This was determined as far back as, as the early as Xi Jinping first came into office, right, during some of those initial reforms. But now we're at a sort of pivotal moment, right? This is the moment where China either establishes a hyper-competitive position, if not dominant position in some of these industries, and through that mechanism achieves, a high-income country status, or not, right? And the latter would potentially condemn China to middle income levels of growth, right, for the duration. And so this is something somewhat existential for China. Now, at the same time, when you read Chinese, or I would say, you know, the wide range of publications that are produced by Chinese scholars that are looking at this issue, they do say that the, you know, geostrategic context is shaping a lot of what China is doing, in part because there is a perception in China that the U.S. and other partner nations are looking to constrain China's abilities in some of these sectors. And so what I think we're seeing is even a reaction to that. So more of a drive, and this new productive forces, you know, narrative is, I think, very much part of that, right? It's saying, look, we have to support these industries. We have to target, you know, regions that are particularly interested in trading in this equipment or technology or services, or in investment in these areas. And, you know, we will do so regardless, because it is fundamental to our own economic growth prospects, but also, as they say, you know, is supportive of you know, addressing the climate crisis in some form or another, if we're talking about, you know, electrification of fleets, or if we're talking about renewable energy or any of the number of other things that China is exporting at the moment. So I think, I mean, it's framed by a lot of things. The primary motivation is China's own what are at the moment, you know, really critical interests in growing at moderate rates. I'm talking 5% for the duration, right? And then also the understanding of that within the framing of what is seen by China as, you know, an opportunity, an effort to constrain this progress. Of course, for the U.S. and others, they're looking to ensure their own economic security as they see their own industry struggling to compete with China and its subsidized offerings.
Thank you, Margaret. Tulio, when answering the question about transfer of technology, Margaret mentioned the local governments, the role of local governments in also discussing these issues. And when you look to Brazil, considering that the diverse geography and the economy of Brazil, how do Chinese investments align with the interests of local governments?
Yeah, well, it's also a good question. As you know, Brazil is a country with huge dimensions, as I mentioned. Some Brazilian states are actually bigger than some of our neighbors in territory and population, sometimes in both perspectives. And it means some of those states have very particular interests that not necessarily need to be aligned to a national strategy or something like that. So let's take the example of São Paulo, a state that received projects in almost all sectors that the Chinese are investing in Brazil. They have most of the Chinese investments in the country, so they naturally have a different approach towards China, in contrast with other states that have irrelevant relations of investment with China, for instance. The state of São Paulo even opened an office in Shanghai in 2019 to foment bilateral trade partnerships in general, and of course to attract Chinese investments, which is a very good example of para-diplomacy here in Brazil. And even before that, it's very clear that São Paulo has a very particular relation with China in many areas besides trade and investment, because the large majority of Chinese living in Brazil are in the state of São Paulo. Most of the Chinese that come to Brazil go to São Paulo as well. And another quick story here, the other day was I saw an ad of a job fair promoted by Chinese companies in Brazil. And not by coincidence, it was in São Paulo. I mean, it's another sign that they clearly have a special relationship with China. But it's not only São Paulo, because right before the pandemic, the states of the northeast part of Brazil formed the Consórcio Nordeste, that could be translated as Northeast Consortium, which is an instrument for the integration of the 9 states of the region. And among their goals is, of course, the attraction of foreign investments. And the region is actually very relevant to the Chinese too. As an example, it attracted most of the Chinese projects in 2019, surpassing the Southeast region for the first and only time in history. And if you visit their website, because they have a website, you will see they have the original version in Portuguese, but also versions in English, Spanish, and Chinese. And I just realized it yesterday because I went to their website to know more about the consortium, and I was very surprised by that fact. It's not common to have websites with Chinese version, but the Consórcio Nordeste already have this Chinese version. So this is another very clear sign that they consider China as a special partner, a strategic partner.
Yes, and we see a lot of trips from Brazilian governors to China. It was very intense before the pandemic, and now since last year, the trips are renewed. And also we have seen a lot of missions from Chinese provinces to Brazil. So I think these negotiations between provinces or between provinces and the local government of China and vice versa can bring very fruitful results. And I think the state of Bahia in the Northeast is an example of the attractiveness for Chinese investments. And we have the BYD factory there, but we also have other projects related to mobility and infrastructure. And I have a question from the audience from Ricardo Lopes Cotes, and I think it can be directly to both of you. Do you believe that FDI can generate a China-led electric vehicle value chain in Latin America with production of lithium in Chile, for example, and manufacturing in Brazil? Would you like to start? Margaret?
I mean, I think that's the intent, from what I can tell, right? You see the sort of the different pieces being put into place at the moment to achieve that precisely this, right? I mean, you have BYD setting up, as Tulio mentioned, and many of you have in the chat, right, in Brazil, but also thinking about establishing a sort of manufacturing and processing capacity in Chile. There's talk of a BYD presence in Mexico. And of course, you know, some of these are very close to the, you know, lithium production centers, if not in the countries where these things are happening. At the same time, as I mentioned before, you have Huawei and others. You know, and I think this is happening not just in the EV sector, but for ICT too, right? So you have lithium, then you have a data center, and then you have the transmission lines and the actual generation capacity to support those. So it's a really remarkable sort of vertical integration approach that China is taking across the board. And yes, I think that is in fact the intent. And the Mexico example is a really fascinating one to me. I don't know if my interpretation is accurate or not, and so I'll put it out there and you all can decide. But you have the situation where you have wide-ranging manufacturers of components, mostly car components and other things, heading to Mexico in very extensive, you know, quantities, contributing to a boom in Nuevo León and a couple of other places in particular. And many of these are producing, you know, for companies that are looking to export to the US market. But if BYD sets up shop there too, right, those things that don't have enough local North American content to export to the North American market can then be used potentially for BYD. And these are very high-tech components that China is bringing to bear, some of it manufactured in Mexico, some of it imported into Mexico. But there seems to be a sort of strategy at play, at least on the part of these companies, but perhaps more broadly, to ensure some degree of, if not, you know, full supply chain integration, then vertical integration in some form within the companies themselves. So the intent is there. We've seen things like this kind of happen in the before, like efforts to link critical infrastructure that is bringing commodities to the Pacific coast through wide-ranging different projects in different countries, and that has worked in some cases and not so much in others. So a lot depends on China's interests, on what happens on the ground, on the wide-ranging factors and actors that shape all of these arrangements, right? It doesn't always play out this way, but it seems that the pieces are falling into place to, in fact, make this happen to some degree in EVs or in other industries.
Great,
Yeah,
great. And then, Tulio,
sorry, no,
go
I
ahead.
agree with I agree with Margaret, and it's very interesting to notice that China is not only investing in lithium extraction like in Argentina or Chile. They already have many car factories in those countries too, and even in the countries that don't have this the lithium reserves. Brazil, for instance, we have small lithium reserves, but it's not that relevant if we compare with Argentina or Chile or Bolivia, for example. But we are actually aware that some of those Chinese companies use or intend to use Brazil as a hub for exporting to the region, because we have a well-established industry here. We have a historic of automakers operating in Brazil. So it's very interesting because I agree that it's they are actually trying to evolve their participation in the value chain, but also including the countries in the region. Yeah, I agree very much with what Margaret said.
Yeah, and that would definitely be something that could benefit the region with an upgrade of production and a different kind of investments now from China. And Margaret, there is a question from Carlos Sucre. It's about BRI. And he asked, could you discuss some more about how this new paradigm is different from the Belt and Road Initiative? Go ahead.
Certainly. I would say it's part of it, right? There were concerns. There was a lot of talk probably about a year ago about how the BRI was dead or dying, was no longer going to be something that factored prominently in China's overall foreign policy. That appears not to be the case at all, right? The BRI continues to be mentioned by China's leadership in high policy in policy and in high level documents and discourse. However, as we know, the Belt and Road Initiative is ever evolving, right? Since day one, since 2013, it's changed from, an initial very specific and very constrained iteration to something that is now global. The motivations, the interests, that China has in articulating through the BRI have also shifted over time, as I mentioned, from, a really explicit focus on large-scale connectivity enhancing and sometimes cross-regional projects in Latin America around 2015, 2016. I'm thinking the Peru-Brazil Railway, right, Transoceanic Railway, to now what is a very different focus, which is consistent, with China's current economic realities. And indeed, the BRI has been shifting consistent with China's current economic realities all along. And so here we are, and we could call it a new phase in the BRI. We could call it a new phase in general in China's engagement with the region, but it's not exclusive from the BRI. And if anything, we've seen an effort to reconceptualize the BRI with these new realities in mind. And part of this, there are a handful of narratives that China is using. The greeting of the BRI, for example, small but beautiful is another term that's been used quite a bit to talk about the kinds of projects that China is pursuing right now. And this is embraced more by some ministries than others. So CIDCA, which is sort of responsible for China's aid and overseas development assistance, has been a real, proponent of this notion of small but beautiful, noting that, the projects are smaller, just as Tulio noted. They have less of a footprint, right? They're ideally less, environmentally and socially impactful, and will contribute to economic growth. Whether that turns out to be the case or not is another question, right? But this is what the message is now. Of course, you talk to the SOEs and they say big and strong is also really great, and we're still interested in a lot of the things that we were interested in before. So it's a real mix, and we just need to understand the BRI as a completely fluid and ever-evolving concept.
Thank you, Margaret. I make the next question to you as well. Is a question from Kelly Mayman Hawk. Kelly, so good to see you here. Margaret, you referenced in your presentation that some Chinese infrastructure activity has been through loans. Any comment on the debt profile that Chinese activity has left in the Americas?
Absolutely. So we have, I mean, it's very different in Latin America than it is in a lot of other places. In that the vast majority of Chinese sovereign lending to the region was focused on just 4 countries. Brazil happened to be one of those, or, you know, rather early on, frankly. Venezuela, unsurprisingly, has accounted for about 60% of China's overall lending over the years, right? Really since around 2007. And then Ecuador and Argentina also factor rather considerably. And then you have a number of Caribbean countries which haven't received all that much in total, right, but have received relatively substantial amounts as a share of their overall, you know, global domestic product. So it's a real mix, but kind of focused in very specific places. What we see now is not a lot of loans. Right? We've seen a real decline over time, really since around 2015 in lending altogether, in part because China isn't lending to Venezuela at all, but because there's been a real change in strategy. One big reason for this is that China doesn't really need to issue these loans anymore to ensure that its companies have opportunities. 10 years ago, that was not the case, right? It was a very competitive environment. These companies were not known. They had no reputation. They had no contacts. They didn't understand the investment environment. That's not true, you know, anymore, not nearly to the same extent that it was. And so you don't need a big loan with a government to ensure company access. They can bid on their own projects. But, you know, so what is the debt profile right now? There is about... I'm struggling to remember the exact amount in Ecuador, but is it 8 billion left over? I'm going to mess that up, Kelly, and I'll have to send you the actual number. In Ecuador, that still needs to be paid off. That was renegotiated. The terms were renegotiated about a year and a half ago, and will be again in about 2.5 years. So there were some, you know, some provisions, some efforts made to reduce the overall debt load, reduce the interest rate, to change the overall term, you know, life of the loan, and other things that were done to try to help Ecuador in that particular context. But really, a lot of this sort of kicked the can down the road another 3 years at this point. So we'll see another negotiation there. On Argentina, it's I mean, it's a process still ongoing. What we've seen very clearly is a real concern, you know, about lending to Argentina at this particular juncture, real hesitance to do so, especially for big projects. And now that the dams in Santa Cruz province are sort of on hold and question altogether, that's yet another reason to maybe reconsider the model of lending there. Where we may see some problems in terms of debt sustainability is in the Caribbean, where you see actually a relatively large amount of debt being Chinese debt, right, in comparison to other places. And there, you know, a lot of that Chinese debt is coming due now. So it will be very interesting to see how China manages this, how the Caribbean countries that are in question will manage this. And this will be kind of, I think, a really important thing for us to monitor in the coming months and years. Thank you, Margaret.
Tulio, a question from Rafael Amiel. Are these Chinese investments exclusively made by state-owned enterprises, or they are private firms having a significant participation in the Latin American region?
Well, actually,
Margaret
yes.
is welcome to comment as well.
Sure. Well, in Brazil, actually, the vast majority of the value invested here is actually from central state-owned enterprises. From 2007 to 2020, actually, as far as I know, almost, I believe, 85 or 86% of all the value invested by Chinese companies here came from those central state-owned enterprises, which are basically those big companies in the energy sector, like State Grid, China Free Gorges, and also from oil companies like Sinopec, Sinopec, and so on. But we also have very interesting investments from Chinese private companies, especially in the technology sector. Basically, all the Chinese companies' investments in these information technology sector are from Chinese private companies, and also in the manufacturing industry, because that's the case of the automakers, BYD, GWM, they are all Chinese private companies. And sometimes we see some companies that are known as companies from Europe, like Volvo, that are actually at least part Chinese companies too, because they were bought some years ago by Geely, for instance, which is also a private company. So in general, the most capital-intensive projects are usually made by Chinese state-owned companies, but we have seen specifically in the more technological intensive projects, some investments from private companies too.
Mm-hmm. Margaret, would you like to add something?
No, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Apologies. Yeah, no, I think that's a really comprehensive overview and tracks more or less across the entire region.
Yeah, and I think when we look at the number of projects, now instead of looking to the value of projects, the participation of the private sector is larger. Not larger than the state-owned enterprise, but larger than when the comparison is made using the value of the investments. No?
Yeah, that's
because
true.
These state-owned enterprises tend to concentrate in this very high capital-intensive projects like hydropower and traditional infrastructure. No? While the private companies, I think they are more involved in this new infrastructure that we are going to see more and more, according to both of you. Well, I think we are reaching the end of our discussion. We've been together for more than an hour. I think it was a terrific debate, and that shed light to new trends of Chinese engagement with Latin America. I thank you very much, Margaret Myers, for the collaboration in organizing this webinar, which is a joint effort of CEBC and the Inter-American Dialogue. And thank you, Tulio, for putting it together and for your insights. And I'd like also to thank our audience for the questions. There are many questions that could not be raised, but they give us a lot of food, things to think about the future of China and Latin American engagement. I now pass the floor to Ambassador Luis Augusto de Castro Neves to make the final remarks. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Claudia. Thanks, Margaret and Tulio. Before closing the seminar, I would refer to one of the questions which were made, I think, by Renato Baumann, and namely, to what extent these investments in technology transfer to the recipient country. I think that the transfer of technology has to do much more with public policies adopted by the country which is aiming at receiving technology. And it also has to do with the degree of opening of the economy and to the regulatory situation, to what extent this is attractive to foreign investment. In Brazil, I would mention the case specifically. But in other words, there may be something to be studied in a future webinar. To what extent the transfer of technology is feasible, is relevant in foreign investment, and specifically in Chinese investment. Having said that, I would like to thank you once again, thank all the participants, and especially thank you, Margaret, for being with us again. And I hope to see you soon in a future webinar, or who knows, in a webinar, not a virtual one, but with the physical presence of all the participants. Well, thank you very much, and see you in the near future. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.